CRM has really evolved over the years, and it's certainly still the place that you go to track your customers and your prospective customers, but it has evolved and expanded into so many areas over the years. And I think that what Tally Street is doing really is a great example of that evolving role of CRM. So Brian, you've built a whole business around this. There's our poll. Go ahead and fill that in while we're chatting here. Brian, you built a business around this kind of evolving and expanding role of CRM. What are some of the insights that I can get as a business owner by enriching my CRM with the data that I have that's locked up in Sage Intacct?
Yeah, and you mentioned the past experience running a liquor distributorship, and maybe I shouldn't have sold that company because that might have been a good business to keep going into kind of the COVID lockdown. I know my kind of making cocktail at home pattern changed quite a bit, but the inspiration for Tally Street comes from that experience combined with the mobile analytics experience before. And essentially, having spent most of my career in the high tech space, where we had access to all kinds of great tools and data warehouses and data lakes and data scientists, we weren't at much of a loss for analytics. But then when I started the liquor distributorship, I had the complete opposite problem, right? I didn't have a data lake. I didn't have a data warehouse. I didn't have data scientists. And I went around and talked to other businesses and basically found that, other small businesses, and they were in the same boat. But we all had accounting systems. And the accounting systems are full of amazing information that we thought was being underutilized. So, all this work is being done to make sure that, invoices get synced and passed to the right places, et cetera. But what we wanted to do is then, once that's done, tease more information out of that. And if you think about just what's on a sales invoice, who the invoice went to, the amount, obviously, when it's due, but every single line item on what somebody bought and what price they paid, et cetera. And if you think of that across all your entire customers, there's just a wealth of information that can be generated, customer analytics or customer insights that could be generated from that underlying data, both on the sales transaction side and then the payments, or collecting AR against those transactions. I'm sure we'll jump into some examples.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about your application and kind of how we've seen it is the ability to zoom into an individual customer, and really also kind of zoom out and look at performance across the board. And so I think that what'll probably resonate the most with the audience is if we could just kind of hop on in. Let's hop into Salesforce. And thank you for those of you that have participated in the poll. Looks like the majority of you are on Salesforce. Again, Brian's app does work with other systems, including ones that were selected there. So I love this. Salespeople, they don't live in the accounting system, or most finance departments don't want the salespeople in the accounting system for good reason. But it's important for them to know after they've actually booked the sale, what has transpired. So Brian, what does that look like?
Yeah, so just really quickly, the way Tally Street works is Tally Street has apps for various accounting packages, including Sage Intacct. We get connected to the accounting platform, and from there start to analyze all that rich, sales transaction information. And then what we do is post the results of that analysis into Salesforce. So here's an example where we're looking at one of the accounts in Salesforce, and about 24, 22, whatever fields that we automatically create on that account object, and then automatically match what we learned from the accounting platform after doing the analytics and the number crunching to that same account inside Salesforce. Again, create these fields and then populate them and then keep them updated. So, some really simple things are items like the first sale date down here at the bottom. I was talking to a customer earlier this week who their first kind of, workflow or really use of the integration was to make better use of just that number, right? So, you're tracking opportunities, but when did the invoice actually go out, and use that date to trigger follow-up calls for renewals, renewing a service or a subscription, or renewing a maintenance contract. Equally, you could work off of something like most recent sale, right? So when was the last time that a customer made a purchase? And if your particular business model is driven by relatively frequent repeat purchases, like my liquor company, ideally bars and stores were buying from me, at least every couple of weeks, at least every month. So if I noticed a repeat sale or a recent sale falling longer than away than that, that was an immediate trigger for me to reach out to that customer and check in and find out what's going on, and make sure that my spirit wasn't being pulled off the menu, for example. And once you get to 50, 100, much less 500 or 1,000 customers, obviously you can't keep all these things in your head, which is why we use Salesforce and why we use Salesforce Automation.
So it's interesting, just kind of thinking about this. It's probably 4 or 5 years ago. We had a customer that was definitely high volume repeat business, and it was very important for them to track that recency and the frequency. And so we were able to kind of put something together in Salesforce, but the big difference is it didn't give us the who has actually paid. It's one thing to make the sale, it's another to collect on it. And so I love the fact that you guys have taken it that next level and really been able to put that payment context around it, not just what are people signing for. So this is really awesome. And this is a great example of kind of that micro customer specific view that's going to be really applicable to an individual salesperson. Brian, what if I'm the CRO and I need to look at the big picture? Talk to me. How does TallyStreet help for that persona?
Yeah, we started with this example of these fields at the individual account level, and yeah, we focus our analytics, like being focused on customer insights or customer intelligence, really are around that entire orders to cash process. So not only kind of who's buying and how much over time, so you see rolled up numbers of lifetime value and sales history, but then how well do they pay? And it's not just which invoices were paid. We focus more at the aggregate level. So things like just what's their overall payment performance. We see this business, paid on time 327 times and late 129 times, but their average days to pay is 32. So they're probably not usually that late. So, having all this information at your fingertips. And when you ask about rolling it up to a bigger picture view for the CFO, the CRO, others in the organization, we can even start to see that here, where we see our sales rank and our customer segment. So this particular customer that I picked is the best customer of the year. So the most sales volume for the year. But a more kind of refined or sophisticated way to start looking at customers is this customer segment. So one thing our analytics does is it takes all the information you see on the screen and more, and then for each customer looks at not only what's their lifetime value and how important are they, but how are their sales growing and changing throughout their time as a customer, and how are they paying throughout their entire time as a customer. And then we automatically group them into, are they a champion, one of your very best customers, or are they maybe a churn risk, or are they a late payment problem? And you can see that at the individual level, but to get to that higher level view, once the information's in Salesforce, you can obviously use it across everything Salesforce does, right? So here's a dashboard we built where you see that segment information. So we can see our champions, right? And the average lifetime value of the champion is over $200,000. We can go down the list and see our next largest category in terms of lifetime value are don't lose them. So these, and the way we define the analytics, these are customers that they might have been champions in the past, but they slowed down their buying. Basically, their sales momentum decreased. So we flag them as you really don't want to lose this customer, right? This really good or promising customer. And within Salesforce, then you can drill into each of these segments and get back to the individual customer view. And then things like don't lose them, or we have another one, which is basically just another category of churn risk. So to identify those customers that are the ones who are starting to drop in terms of their engagement, so that the sales team, the CRO, the CFO, et cetera, they get a kind of an early predictive warning that based on that particular company's sales cadence and history, that these individual accounts are starting to fall outside of those norms, and therefore they get flagged as a possible risk and something to pursue. And then the same thing can happen on kind of the accounts receivable side, right? So you can merge, again, that orders to cash process. So looking at which customers are overdue, which customers have large outstanding balances, and making that available to people on the team, because there are lots of different use cases and across kind of an organization where they would need access to that outstanding invoice information.
Yep. So one of the things that we see a lot in our customers is that when you have commissioned salespeople, they certainly need to be out there closing the deals, but oftentimes they don't get paid their commissions on what is sold, but what is actually collected. And so I love the view that you've brought in here to say, hey, you know, these guys are overdue. If you want to get that commission check, you know, these are the people you need to go after. And there's probably a lot of controllers and CFOs out there who pre-pandemic had the sales guy, you know, walking by their door 3 times a day to see what checks came in the mail. And you know, TallyStreet kind of takes that friction. There's never friction between sales and finance, I know, but it takes that friction out of the way between those groups. So I think what's really cool is that all this data lives here in the Salesforce platform. And when we have data that lives in Salesforce, we can certainly put these great analytics on top of it. But we can also leverage the underlying power of the platform to provide some automation around these things. So if I'm that sales guy and I'm not getting paid until the check comes in, and you know, I want to know who I need to go ask for payment from, how has TallyStreet brought the automation? So we've got the insight here. How have we brought automation to the table to actually push as opposed to pull?
Yeah, it's you know, larger companies have specific applications in many cases for AR automation, just for that purpose. They go out and buy another entire product or suite just for that. But the way we approach it in combination with the CRM is, if you think about it, the CRM is already the hub center for all customer engagement and communication. And then if you merge in the individual sales invoices, as well as the aggregate kind of analysis that TallyStreet provides, you essentially get AR automation, you know, kind of built in, right, in the same platform that everybody can use. So we built in an example together of an automation which shows a flow of basically looking for customers whose overdue balance becomes greater than 0. So basically, whenever that happens, when account is triggered by that overdue balance going over than 0, you can kick off a number of steps. And just as some ideas, you know, they might include automatically sending an email to the customer, just a polite payment reminder. Or you might check and see if they've paid later on, or maybe, depending on the customer, skip right to something like an internal task instead. So using the flow process to automatically make sure that the collections team and or the account manager, right, are aware of the problem and get that kind of notice and the awareness to quickly follow up. So there's just a lot of options, and, you know, fully automating it, automating task assignments, as you know, Scott, as you know, and I'm sure others on the call who are more expert at Salesforce than I am. I mean, there's probably no end to the things that you can do inside Salesforce once you enrich it with some extra insights and information.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you know, the power of the Salesforce platform is such that if we have data that resides in Salesforce, we can go and you know, in most cases, kick off some pretty sophisticated kind of workflows. Um, so we've looked at this from the perspective of the individual sales rep. We've taken that kind of CRO across the board view. But one of the other things that I like about TallyStreet is that it caters to other personas, including the CFO and the folks in the finance department. And you know, the benefit of this living in Salesforce is that the salespeople that don't live in the accounting system, they get a view into this in the world that they live in. And oftentimes, you know, we see some finance folks that are into CRM, but most of their day is in the accounting system. Show us or talk to us about how you provide kind of that middle ground, that insight for that finance person, where we can kind of bridge both the sales side and the finance side.
Yeah, so we obviously love the CRM integration aspect as a way to democratize information and get it to everybody. But we also, kind of as you said, people want to receive information in different ways. They're in different systems. So we also, especially for kind of CROs and collections teams, we produce information that we distribute in reports and spreadsheets directly. And you'll see the overlap between what's in the CRM. So for example, if you're to quickly look at the high level, if you're the CFO, you might want a quick monthly report that summarizes your sales numbers for the month, you know, how your annual kind of run rate is growing, high level view of sales and income. And then you'll quickly see we start to get into things like retention rates, which we talked about at the beginning. So using that sales data to automatically compute customer retention and even net revenue retention, which is something that you know, a lot of CFOs, a lot of sales teams are still doing in, you know, spreadsheets or having to do an extra kind of external analysis. So automatically generate that along with little insights, you know, to some of the charts to kind of highlight, you know, when things are going well, when things are going maybe not so well, and other areas to look. Oops. And get back to that. And then you'll see the same kind of, you know, segment information. And then kind of as we talk about the CFO and the collections process, and then we can go to the next level of detail that's more task oriented. But you know, detailed information around how the collections team is performing overall. So, you know, this is kind of maybe in the weeds and accounting, but what we like about this particular metric, collection effectiveness, is it's a really easy to understand high level number that you can motivate and reward a team on. So when we see 86%, that basically means 86% of what was supposed to have been collected that month was collected. So different customers get different terms, you know, things happen, but this is a way to easily kind of track the entire process, the revenue operations team, the collections team, and reward that performance. And to help with that, we also have a weekly email that's much more task oriented. And this gets down into, you know, how you're progressing in the quarter, but then quickly gets into how to improve that collections process. And this is where we use the analytics to take a different approach. So instead of kind of prioritizing the oldest things or maybe just the largest things first, what we start to look for is customers who have, you know, a large amount overdue. That still matters, but again, we look for payment behavior that's changed. So in this case, we basically see, you know, a 52-day customer is more important than a 119-day customer, even though the dollar amount's really not that different. And some of that's because you know, maybe this third customer, Fairy Inc., always pays late, and you know, nobody likes it, but at least it's understandable, it's predictable, it's not a surprise, and it can be prioritized in that way. Where maybe the first company, you know, used to pay in 30 days, and then it was 40, and now it's 50, 60, right? And that's an alarm. So this is kind of more task-oriented information that can get shared with the finance team so that they can prioritize their collection efforts and, you know, make the sales team and the CRO and everybody else happier because the money's actually coming in the door. And then they also get, you know, a lot of the information we saw in that inside Salesforce can also be shared with the team, you know, just in spreadsheets, right? So we'll give them every single customer and that same kind of, you know, customer segment information. So for the accountant who maybe is not comfortable in Salesforce, but wants that rolled up aggregate information in a spreadsheet, they can access it this way as well.
Well, thanks for showing that. Salesforce does have a decent reporting engine, but the aggregation that you do, the change in behavior is just not something that can be done natively or easily within the Salesforce platform. And you guys make that super, super simple. Before we get into questions, Brian, are there any other, things that you think are important to call out and highlight?
I think, what maybe the underlying, not a technology thing, but more of an operational thing. You talked in the beginning about the CRM being the center and the hub, and what we're seeing more of, and it started in the tech world, but now we're seeing it across other businesses, is this new kind of role or function of revenue operations, which is really, you used to have sales operations and marketing operations, and you had accounting. And businesses are getting better about combining those three so that the sales, the marketing, and the finance teams can all be better aligned. And so we see this RevOps role really growing, kind of like DevOps did in the tech world. And I think that's going to drive a lot of the opportunity for this, combining and aggregating things into CRMs like Salesforce. So I think that's something to really keep an eye on, read up on. Hopefully, everybody to explore for your own organizations, because it's just it really makes it a lot more scalable, efficient, keeps everybody quote unquote on the same page. Makes a really big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We see. We talk a lot about kind of these hub and spoke models, and typically CRM is a pretty significant hub, and finance is a pretty significant hub, and within finance you've got spokes coming off. It might be your payroll, it might be your expense management, it might be some sort of fulfillment system, and then on the Salesforce side, on the CRM side, you've got marketing automation, you've got third-party data sources that are bringing data in, enriching data, and just on and on and on. But TallyStreet's really unique in that it's kind of a spoke that joins both of those two. It touches both. So, well, appreciate that. Mel, do we have any questions coming through?
We do, yes. So we had one come in asking, have you seen any nonprofits using Nonprofit Success Packer, NPSP, utilize this application for invoicing? The example provided was mission trip invoices.
Brian, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we've certainly seen some nonprofit activity. I don't know as much about the different kind of aspects, packs, success packs, but we've seen, I think Sage, Intact has a good presence in the nonprofit space. So we've worked with some nonprofit companies who are using the same information to manage, the example that immediately comes to mind is donations, right? So keeping track of which donors have contributed and when and how much, and managing that in some similar ways as you would with a customer, really viewing that donor as a client or a customer.
Good deal.
Okay, a couple more here. Does TallyStreet replace the Salesforce Intact connector?
That is a good question, and I can totally understand where that question would come from. So kind of like we said earlier, the delineating the roles of that Venn plays and that TallyStreet plays. TallyStreet is not there to sync your master data and your transactional data at the transaction level like the Salesforce connector is. That tool is very, very much made to get the transactions across the system. TallyStreet is simply going to take that data once it's come across and do the analysis on it but it's not going to replace that that transaction focused integration. That's an astute, insightful question for sure.
Okay, one more here, and this may have kind of piggyback off of what you were just saying, but what accounting data does TallyStreet impact?
So the good news is we don't, so it depends how you define the word impact. The good news is we don't impact the accounting data at all. So what we do is we're essentially, TallyStreet is read-only from the accounting system. So, as Scott said, we're really focused on that analytics. So we're not creating invoices, syncing invoices, changing invoices. What we're really doing is analyzing that invoice and payment data, and then producing the kind of really rich analysis, and then distributing that through, the PDFs we saw, spreadsheets, and integrations with Salesforce. So our impact on the accounting system is really, really lightweight in that it's read only. And also we're focused on customers. So we're looking at customer detail, invoices, and payments. We're not looking at employees. We're not looking at any kind of internal data that would be, even more sensitive. Obviously your customer data is sensitive, but it's a very, read-only, safe, secure, targeted analytics solution that's focused on those customer insights and doesn't impact the rest of the accounting process.
Great. Okay.
I understand the wariness around that.
Absolutely. And with Salesforce, it's kind of, to maybe just extend that a little bit, the impact of Salesforce is also, minor. Obviously we're changing things in Salesforce, but we're changing these new fields, that are created. So it's new, fields or properties at the account level, which we're updating. So any existing Salesforce, process, automation, et cetera, is not impacted in any way, shape, or form. It's just now there's more information to incorporate into any of those other processes.
So you're not going to overwrite my account name or the address or anything like that?
Not at all. Not at all. We want to, we want to make it as easy to kind of start combining these. I think you said earlier when you talked about spokes, right? We view the accounting system as one hub and the CRM as another hub. And then, we want to basically move analytics information, from one to the other and create more value that way.
We've had a couple more questions come in. So you're sparking something. So another one asking, would this replace an AR automation package?
It's a good question. And I think, that's something I'll go back to this flow. I mean, that's something that we think there's really potential to do, right? So once you have the transaction level data synced across, and then now you have extra analytics information synced across, you have everything you need to and you have the communications, customer engagement structure, task management, et cetera, that's inside Salesforce. So you have a lot of the components that you get in an AR, automation system. You want to make it easy to collect payments as well, right? But there are a lot of components there. So I think that's absolutely something that we think businesses can do as the CRM becomes more and more central to communications with the customer. It can make a lot of sense to do your AR automation out of your CRM too, instead of maintaining and managing customer communication in an entirely other platform. I mean, now your sales team can know when that account has been contacted by the collections team instead of it being completely disjointed.
Okay, so that's prompted another one. Would you be able to attach a payment portal?
I might defer to Scott on this one because I think you might know more about kind of payment possibilities in Salesforce than I do. Yeah.
We actually do a lot in terms of integrating payments through Intact and where applicable, writing payment data back into Salesforce. And we actually have something in the works right now that would serve as kind of that front end collection mechanism where someone could actually go in and put in their credit card or ACH information, we're not quite ready to fully take the wraps off of that, but it is coming. But I think it's important, though. I think that the nature of the question was, is TallyStreet going to actually be the mechanism by which a payment is received? And the answer is no. It's automating and helping you know who you need to go to for collection, not the actual collection tool itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so sorry if I might have missed that, but yeah, we're not TallyStreet is not a payments platform. We're a, customer intelligence or analytics platform, but we don't process payments or provide a way to process payments. So that would be, there are lots of others out there that do that already really well. And, as Scott said, ways to kind of integrate and tie things together. So we don't see that as something we need to recreate.
I have a feeling I know who's asking the question. Haven't looked at the registration list, so I will reach out to you later and see if we can kind of bring a 1-2 punch with TallyStreet and this other thing that we're working on. Anything else? Any other questions?
No other questions that I'm seeing from our end. So I guess we can go ahead and wrap up here, Brian, if you want to go to our very last slide, if you can tab over to it. Big thanks for everyone who took the time out of your day to join us. If you're interested in learning more about how to go about enriching your CRM data, please feel free to visit. We threw the URLs up on the slide, tallystreet.com/pricing if you want to jump right into what the pricing might be for the different packages. I know that there is a free, you can get started free for just under a couple minutes. You can go ahead and sign up and start playing around with it. So go ahead and check out TallyStreet online. And then as Scott has mentioned a couple times throughout the presentation, if you have any Salesforce questions or data that you're trying to automate into Intact, please feel free to visit us on our website. You can shoot us a message on our contact form. We'd love to schedule a meeting with you. And then be on the lookout for a survey as well as a recording of today's discussion here the next couple of days. Otherwise, thanks again and have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much for joining us.
And one final thing, Brian and his team are very eager to get this into the hands of Venn's customers and into the Intact world. And so they are offering a white glove service to help you guys get rocking and rolling with it. And so if this is of interest, Brian and his team will take very, very good care of you.
Thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate it. And this was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.